The post office scandal. Is Parliament about to take the extraordinary step of overturning postmaster and mistresses' convictions? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Sir Alex Shelbrooke, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, Anoosh Chakalian from The New Statesman and Conservative Home's Henry Hill. Today...
I just switched off. I didn't know what to do.
It's horrendous. It's the worst thing. You just don't want to ever go through.
I've carried the shame ever since. I refuse to carry it any longer.
The suffering of wrongly convicted sub-postmasters and mistresses. We're expecting to find out how the government will right those miscarriages of justice in the next hour or so. We'll bring you that live.
The bill simply doesn't work, and that's all I'm interested in. I think it's all the public really care about.
Tory rebels demand changes to the bill that aims to get migrants on planes to Rwanda. But are they prepared to defeat the government? Keir Starmer takes on Rishi Sunak for the first Prime Minister's questions of 2024. But could those roles be reversed by the end of this election year? Well, this is potentially a big day for hundreds of sub-postmasters and mistresses still awaiting justice and compensation for being wrongly accused of theft or false accounting by the Post Office over the last 20 years. Now, the government now wants to address this huge injustice that's caused so much suffering to many, many people over decades. We've been told that there could be an announcement imminently, and we will bring you that live when it comes or just beforehand. The question is, which option will the government go for? Will they legislate to overturn all those convictions, effectively a universal pardon? Or are there some serious constitutional issues connected to that? Do you think they should just universally pardon all those wrongly convicted?
I'm not opposed to the idea, because I think that what we have seen is literally one of the biggest miscarriages of justice. I was making representations to James Arbuthnot 10 years ago for constituents who had come to me, and I've heard stories of people who, when the Horizon system was brought in and they went for training, went home and said, time to sell, I've been postmaster for 30 years, this system is going to collapse. So that was right at the very beginning. And, it's gone on and on and on. So I'm not opposed to that idea. We'll wait and see what he said, but what people definitely need is justice in their favour.
Are there constitutional difficulties, though, Shami? Effectively, this would be Parliament, politicians, to some extent, overriding or interfering even with the independence of the judiciary?
Well, it's certainly not anything like as controversial as Rwanda, which we'll come to later, which is, of course, Parliament saying, the highest court in the land says X and we say Y.
In terms of Rwanda being a safe country.
And why I think this is justified and that is not, is that this is to benefit people, not to their detriment. And because the scale of the institutional corruption over so many years and the fact that people have lost their lives, are running out of time, some of them, in their old age, justifies this this particular measure. You could argue that it's a modern evolution of old-fashioned pardons. I don't think this should just be pardons, by the way. I think this should be actual blanket quashing of conviction. So I would go further.
Right.
Because these people need to be... A pardon is normally when we accept that, for example, some anti-gay offences were wrong.
Well, that's
the people were justly convicted for an
At
unjust law, but here they were unjustly convicted for just laws like fraud and wrongful accounting and so on. So I think I agree with Robert Buckland, who of course was a former Lord Chancellor.
Yeah.
And by the way, I add the tribute to Lord Arbuthnot.
He was MP at the time, representing one of the wrongly convicted
comes across pretty well in the drama, by the way. And why does it take, by the way? Congratulations to ITV. It's the other channel, but why does it take TV primetime drama for this farce of a government to suddenly spring into
well, that, of
action.
course, is a whole other discussion, in fact, but it's definitely led to incredible political momentum when it's come to this issue, because, as we heard from Alex Shelby, it's been going on for decades. You had constituents as well who suffered at the hands of this scandal. But should the government take that step?
Well, I think it's quite a panicked move, and it's not ideal for politicians to be overriding the role of the judiciary. It is drastic. And I do think the government wouldn't have to take last-minute, hasty measures like this if they actually gave timely justice and compensation to victims of big miscarriages of justice like this. It's not just the postmasters, it's also the victims of the Windrush scandal. Some of them are still waiting for compensation. The infected blood scandal as well. I was speaking to a child just yesterday of someone who was a victim of that scandal who's been waiting decades. There were families, Grenfell families, as late as June last year, who were still stuck in temporary accommodation. Why does this take so long, and why do we have to reach this point?
Right, and we will, of course, at some stage discuss if there'll be any systemic change to prevent that sort of delay in justice and compensation. Do you think the government should take the extraordinary step of overriding these convictions and quashing them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's perfectly constitutionally proper. Parliament, as the High Court of Parliament, is actually the highest court in the land, not the Supreme Court. Parliament has the right to pass laws to any effect that it likes, and we already have laws which involve Parliament substituting judicial findings of fact for the will of Parliament. There's Rwanda. There's also the gender recognition certificate. Supplants a finding of fact by a judge as to somebody's legal gender with a declaration by Parliament that somebody holding X certificate is that. So all of these things are actually perfectly normal. The circumstances are unusual, but I think one of the strengths of our Constitution, whilst we do need systemic reform, is that it does have the flexibility that when you do have a clarion cry for justice like this, Parliament can take an extraordinary step, and you don't have to wait for the gears of some great arcane mechanism to grind very slowly, as they tend to in these things. And so, no, it's entirely proper. Right,
we're going to return to this issue before Prime Minister's questions, because we were told by a minister earlier today that an announcement by the government was imminent, so there could be a statement by Rishi Sunak at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions. But let's talk about Rwanda. It's been mentioned in this discussion because, rather surprisingly, it was announced yesterday that the emergency legislation, you may remember, introduced by Rishi Sunak following the Supreme Court ruling that Rwanda was not a safe country to deport migrants to for their asylum claims to be processed, is back in Parliament next week. That has led to a flurry of activity from within the Conservative Party and those groups who don't feel that the legislation is tough enough. If we have a look at this in the Daily Mail, Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, failure to act to stop illegal immigration would be a betrayal of the British people. There are a number of Conservative MPs who have tabled amendments what they say will toughen up the bill and prevent last-minute legal interference by international courts. We heard from the former Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, there in the headlines. Well, let's talk to another Conservative MP, Jonathan Gullis, one of those Tories who is supporting the amendments. What are you hoping to achieve when Rishi Sunak has already clearly said this emergency legislation won't allow any foreign court to block flights to Rwanda?
Well, Joe, there's two central tenets to the amendments that we've put forward. One is that we will end the never-ending merry-go-round of individual claims, and the other one is to make it abundantly clear that the default position of the government is to ignore these pyjama injunctions, Rule 39 orders that come from Strasbourg. Because if we don't do that, we won't see significant numbers, if indeed at all a plane, take off to Rwanda, which would be then abject failure ahead of a general election, where we know the government's own legal adviser said there's only a 50% chance of getting a flight off in the first place. I don't think that's right. We want to move the odds in the government's favour, and that's why we think these amendments, which have been written by legal experts that have legal opinions supported by a very eminent KC, that has said that he believes not only is this within still the scope of international legal arguments, but therefore would not be a risk, therefore, to the Rwandan government from pulling out. So we think we've met the Prime Minister's tests.
You don't believe the Prime Minister then, do you? When he says, I won't let any foreign court block these flights, these deportations to Rwanda, you don't believe him and you don't believe the legal advice that he's received?
What we know Joe, is that we saw the Prime Minister on Laura Kuenssberg's show on Sunday make it clear that he was unable to answer whether or not he would be able to ignore a Rule 39 order, pyjama injunction. That is because the stated legal position, I believe, of the government, from the advice that I've seen reported, is that it would be without, not within scope of international law to ignore it. So therefore, we would argue other countries like France, who very recently took a alleged terror suspect back to Uzbekistan, ignoring what Strasbourg had said about Uzbekistan being safe, means that we should make the automatic default position, therefore taking it out of ministers' hands and actually putting it in the hands of Parliament to determine that, which is what we are here as parliamentarians to do.
All right. If the amendments aren't accepted, and at the moment it doesn't look as if they will you vote against the bill?
I'm leaving all options on the table, Joe.
Well,
I'll be perfectly frank about
Jonathan.
that.
You've made a very strong case and you believe it's legally watertight. I presume you will vote against the bill if those amendments aren't tabled.
Well, actually, what I want to do is spend the time in good faith that I have been doing over the Christmas period with others like Robert Jenrick, Danny Kruger, Miriam Cates and Bill Cash in engaging with Number 10 directly and the Home Secretary, who have been very gracious and giving a lot of time to hear what we have to say and to go through in detail what it is that we propose and give them the space to hopefully do the right thing, which I believe is to accept these amendments to make the bill as solid as possible. And then, of course, I'll have to come to a decision post committee stage, post-report stage, or what I'll do at third reading. But until I've gone through those first two stages, I will not be making a decision at this time.
But unless you are firm in carrying out the threat of voting against the bill, why should the Prime Minister listen to you? Why should we listen to you?
Well, if you look at what happened at second reading, I was one of 29 members who decided to abstain on that vote, and since then we've had very constructive engagement and conversations. That's how you act in Parliament in good faith, and I know that the Prime Minister takes this issue very seriously, which is in stark contrast to the Labour Party, who simply do not have a plan at all.
We'll come on to the Labour.
And ultimately are going to allow to bring 100,000 plus people from Italy or other parts of the Mediterranean, the border of the Mediterranean, to our country, which would actually add more pressure to our hotels, more cost to the British taxpayer, and surrender our borders to their buddies in Brussels.
You haven't got the numbers, have you? That's why you can't say that you'll vote against the bill.
Well, actually, if you look, Joe, at the amendments, we've got over 30 people who have signed and more people are coming forward today, so more names will be added in the week ahead. So we have already got significant amount of numbers supporting our amendments, and therefore we hope that we can engage constructively with the government.
All right. Jonathan Gullis, thank you very much for joining us. Alex Shelbrooke, listening to that, Rishi Sunak, I mean, he's right, Jonathan, wouldn't answer that question about whether he would be prepared, whether he'd be tough enough to sort of echo the words of Jonathan Gullis to ignore Rule 39 orders. So a Strasbourg court at the last moment, pyjama injunctions. Oh, we're just looking at Rishi Sunak leaving, by the way. You can see pictures there, leaving Number 10 and heading to the Commons. And, of course, as we have said already, if there is an announcement by the Post Office, about the Post Office, we will bring that to you live at 12 o'clock. Sorry, to go back to you, Alec, is he just not tough enough, Rishi Sunak, on this piece of legislation? And that's why he couldn't say, I will ignore any Rule 39 from the Strasbourg court.
It's been my observation that he's been more keen to push this through than any of the previous Prime Ministers, that I think it is a policy that he personally has a lot of faith in, something he believes in and wants to push through. I'm always slightly nervous about how we reflect upon rulings from the ECHR, because the one everybody gets very excited about was a reflection on what our own courts had said. It didn't come from the ECHR, it came from the High Court, and the ECHR backed it up. And I think there has to be a move away from trying to blame other bodies because we don't like the decisions that our courts made. And I think, therefore, within the parliamentary system, you have to look at it. I think the bill he's brought forward is trying to steer that path between what the Supreme Court said and what Rwanda has said they would accept. And I think that's often overlooked. And many of these amendments run the risk of Rwanda saying, no, thank you, we're not going down that road, and it is self-defeating. And I am reminded that you have to be careful what you declare in law. You know, the Emperor Nero got the Senate to declare he was a god. So I think we have to be careful what we just declare in law.
Right, well, we've had a lot on that discussion about what we declare in law. What do you make of Jonathan Gullis and his colleagues in their determination to toughen up the bill, as they call it? Do they have the numbers?
I don't think so. I mean, we saw this with the great sort of mass abstention, right? Like the numbers were much lower than we were expecting, and
it's a bit different at third reading, I suppose.
Yeah, but I don't think that we've seen no real evidence that they have the numbers, and they won't even tell you whether they'll vote it down, right? Which means that the whips will be factoring that in as well. The problem is they're sort of, whether or not you agree with them on any of the ethical principles, they're right on the logistics in that Rishi Sunak is trying to thread an impossible needle, which is resolve boat crossings without having any kind of fundamental reckoning with the existing structure of Britain's international commitments, which you can't really do. And so he's consistently chosen a form of the bill which leaves open lots of ground to failure, and then it fails, and then he tries something else. And so that analysis is correct enough. The problem is that the bill that they want won't pass, right? Like there were lots of potential rebels on the One Nation side last time who would potentially vote it down in the Commons. But if you turned it into the bill that they're proposing with all those amendments, it would just get torn to pieces in the House of Lords. There's not time to use the Parliament Act, so Rishi Sunak couldn't force it through. So realistically, what the rebels have to think is if they actually want a Rwanda bill, it has to be a Rwanda bill that will pass the Commons and the Lords. If what they actually want is to lose the bill and then be able to spend the summer blaming the House of Lords for that, that's a different political question.
Right, if it is amended, let's say Jonathan Gullis is right and the Prime Minister does take on some of the amendments, or all of them, for that matter, would you then vote against it?
Well, I mean, that all depends on what amendments are in scope, what comes forward. I know there is a long way to go, and believe me, if I've learned anything in the last few years, it's until the day we get there and the government may suddenly announce something at the time, I don't know is the answer to your question, because it literally depends what's in front of you. But, I mean, there's, I think, 12 amendments been put in by colleagues, and I think there's another 2 amendments been put in by Rob Roberts. There's no way the Speaker is going to allow all of those amendments to go through.
But if it's changed in any way, would you vote against it?
Well, I've got to weigh up to what it actually says, what the Prime Minister thinks is how he's going to steer that path. But I come back to he's trying to address the court rulings against what Rwanda will accept. And I think that some colleagues have got to wake up to the fact that they may demand that a bill says X, Y, Z, but if Rwanda say that's too far, they've got nothing. They've got no policy at all. So I think it's about the art of negotiation. I mean, it is threading the eye of a needle, but, I mean, it is a path that the Prime Minister needs to walk.
It is a very narrow path, it seems, and I'll come to Shami in a moment to discuss as to whether what Shami and the Labour Party are doing in opposition is stopping any prospect of people being deported, which is what, you know, constituents want, some Tory MPs claim. But before that, the One Nation group that Henry was talking about, how likely are they to vote it down if it is amended in the way Jonathan Gullis would like?
Well, I had a chat with Damian Green, who is the chair of this group of One Nation MPs, the more moderate wing, and there's 106 of them, and he said this comes within an inch of what they find acceptable. They don't all think the same thing, but, you know, he is the representative of that group. So I think if any of these amendments from the right of the party are adopted by the government, then I don't think a big chunk of those MPs would be able to vote it through. He said, we're like a piece of elastic. We will stretch and we will stretch until we snap. And what would make them snap, he told me, was any further on limiting the appeals that individual migrants can make, and also any breaches of international law, not just the ECHR, but also the Convention on Refugees and the Convention Against Torture.
The thing is, if it gets to the Lords, will the Lords block it in its current form?
Well, the bill in its current form seeks to reverse a finding of fact by our Supreme Court. So, in my view, it's contrary to the domestic rule of law in its intention. The bill as proposed by Mr Gullis, and goodness me, what a happy Christmas he must have had with his chums, full of comfort and joy. And I pray for ITV1 to produce a drama humanising refugees in the way that they have about postmasters. But what they propose is to ignore the international rule of law. And I would say to, not just to One Nation Conservatives, but all Conservatives, to dig into their own history, because there is no political force in Europe that made a greater contribution to the formulation of the ECHR than the British Conservative Party, as led by Winston Churchill and David Maxwell Fyfe. And for this moment, with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, to be saying that we should ignore the international rule of law. There are Rule 39 orders currently in place preventing Russia from killing prisoners of war. Is this the time for us to say that we will ignore any potential Rule 39 orders against the UK not to send people to an unsafe place like Rwanda?
What do you say to that, Alec?
I don't disagree, and this is the point I'm making, is that there are rules in place. Look, almost every country in Europe...
But you do support the bill.
Yeah, but you see, again, to come back to the Prime Minister did not answer that question. And I think that you have to look at the legal context it's in, because there are plenty of countries in Europe, most of the countries in Europe, whether in the EU or not, are members of the ECHR, and they do these things that we're saying are impossible. I mean, through my NATO work, was in Latvia. I mean, Latvia return people straight away if they come in from Belarus, and they do it at gunpoint. Now, I'm not sure that people would say, well, they can't be a member of the ECHR, because they're working within their laws and their rules. We've adopted it differently.
Right.
So
the Prime Minister shouldn't ignore...
I don't think a Prime Minister could ignore rulings of law. I think there's consequences to that. He might want to. He might want to signal that he would. He might want to add tough. But I'm not sure that you can ignore law. Now, Parliament may be able to change the law. It may be able to move things forward and change it and adapt it. But I don't think you can just ignore it.
Right. So Jonathan Gullis is right that actually there will be all sorts of legal claims, pyjama injunctions, as they call them, at the last moment, and no plane will ever take off to Rwanda.
I mean, I don't know. The bill as drafted does try and restrict the grounds on which an individual can appeal. I think technically you can only appeal against Rwanda if you're in danger from Rwanda itself as a country. I mean, ultimately, the government in this country, the international law only applies to the extent that it applies in domestic law, right? So the government could legislate to allow, Parliament could legislate to allow the government to ignore Rule 39 orders. Other countries such as France do that. Rishi Sunak doesn't want to do that. And if he doesn't want to do that and he doesn't want to do all the rest of it, then yeah, of course, eventually this is going to get clogged up, because there are just so many points in the process of deporting any person at which they can appeal,
France
they can add time.
To ignore Rule
no, but they just ignored
about what's
it.
happened in practice.
Yeah, I didn't say they legislated.
Why don't we get back to the fundamental
let's get back to the fundamental.
Rwanda is not safe.
Right, but also there is the fundamental situation about how you deal with asylum claims. This headline in The Guardian, Labour reportedly considering offshoring asylum seekers' claims too. Now, Labour has been very clear that they would oppose and do oppose the Rwanda scheme if they were in power. But Keir Starmer has been talking about an offshoring scheme in general, because, of course, what has been ruled within the law is having a third country to process asylum claims. Are you happy with that?
I personally, morally and politically, am not comfortable with shipping people around like sacks of carrots to be processed in other places. However, I will separate my moral and political belief from what the Supreme Court found. And what the Supreme Court was dealing with was whether Rwanda is a safe place to either process claims and to treat refugees. And it found no on both counts. Now, if Keir Starmer or anybody else wants to explore people's claims being processed in another country for the purposes of returning those who succeed in getting asylum to the UK, I will look at their plans and I will debate their plans. But to be absolutely clear, what is proposed by the current scheme is that you do not pass go, you do not collect £500, you go to Rwanda, even if, like 60% of these people, you are likely to get a refugee status, in which case you'll stay in Rwanda.
Right. Can you convince Shami about the worthiness of the Rwanda scheme, that it is a safe country?
Well, I think one of the things I would point out is that we're not the only country in Europe looking at the Rwanda scheme. The EU itself is looking at the Rwanda scheme, Germany, I believe, I think Denmark.
And Denmark certainly looked at it and then dropped it.
It'll be interesting to see the conclusions they come to in those areas. This is not a standalone policy.
And one of the things the Supreme Court found was that the Israel scheme didn't work because Rwanda is not safely processing those claims. And the key witness in that case was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that has a special status under the Refugee Convention and expertise to look at whether an asylum system is safe. And Rwanda is not currently safe. Now, I don't say it couldn't be in the future. I want all countries in the world to be safe for refugees in the future. But you can't do it with the flick of a pen. And that is what the government is proposing with this treaty.
Do you accept, though, Shami, that if Labour get to power and they were to introduce a scheme with a third country, it wouldn't be a million miles away from Rwanda? I mean, not geographically, the scheme wouldn't be a million miles away from the Rwanda policy.
There are two issues. One is what I call the moral issue of whether you should be shipping people around like chattels, even for the purposes of processing. And then the second point is, at the end of the process, what will happen to genuine refugees? Will they come to the UK, or will we subcontract our duties under the Refugee Convention to give people asylum?
Is it a vote winner, Rwanda, the scheme?
Well, I mean, clearly the Conservative Party have staked their electoral prospects on this scheme.
Culture war.
Yeah, and I don't really understand why, because so far they've been failing. This whole discussion has been about how difficult it is for Rishi Sunak to walk that line. But also, you know, also legal migration is going up. It's at a record high, and there's, you know, they're clearly not doing what they're saying they want to do on this policy issue. And so making it one of the 5 pledges and making such a big deal out of it as they have been over the past few months it just highlights how vulnerable they are on this issue. So, you know, it could be a vote-winning issue among a certain core of the electorate, but not if they're failing on it. And it doesn't look like they're going to be succeeding on it anytime soon. So I wouldn't call it a vote-winning issue.
All we need is ITV to do a drama. And these people will be human. These people will be human again. I believe this government is out of touch with people's primary concerns over the cost of living and with their sense of decency.
Do you agree with that? Just finally, do you agree with that? That something like that would change people's perceptions? Or is there a very strong feeling that this is an issue that still hasn't been grappled with?
I mean, ultimately, no. It would grind. It might for a little bit. Remember the Aylan Kurdi front pages did it for a little bit, but eventually it would grind back down because this is a long-term problem. The Rwanda scheme is what happens when the government wants to run on immigration, and legal immigration is at 750,000 people a year, and the Treasury won't let you change that. So that's why you end up talking about illegal migration, and the government was originally more optimistic about passing the original bill and winning its court cases than it was now. But yeah, the next election is going to be resolved on the cost of living. This is important to a section of Conservative voters because the channel crossings are a visible loss of control, but no, it's not going to decide the election.
It's just under 20 minutes until Prime Minister's questions. As we have been forecasting, we are expecting an announcement, a possible announcement. You can see inside the Commons chamber there, we saw Rishi Sunak leave at number 10 for the Palace of Westminster a short time ago, perhaps in preparation for making an announcement around quashing the convictions of those wrongly convicted of theft and false accounting by the Post Office over a 20-year or so period. Henry mentions what's going to be fought over at the election, cost of living. Let's have a look at the polls, because as we approach the first PMQs of the election year, it's a good time to take stock. General election voting intention. Well, Labour at 45%, the Conservatives on 25%. It's been a pretty sustained lead of around 20 points for the Labour Party over the Conservatives, but could Rishi Sunak overturn that? Let's talk to Professor of British Politics at Oxford University, Jane Green. Jane, answer that question. Could that lead be overturned before polling day?
I think the context is incredibly important here to remember that there have been really fundamental blows to the Conservatives' reputation since they won the election in 2019. So are these kind of fundamental blows reversible? You know, one of them was COVID handling, one of them was Partygate, and one of them was the Truss mini budget. And then the cost of living crisis has followed that. So I think the fundamentals are kind of set, and it's going to be very difficult for there to be a very, very substantial change. What might happen, however, is some of the undecided voters that the Conservatives have. So in 2019, those people who voted Conservative, many of them haven't moved to the Labour Party. They're still undecided about how they might vote in a general election. And they also lean more Conservative. So that might change something. There could be some event that we can't foresee, you know, something really dramatic that could change.
We've had a lot of those
parties. We're also keeping a really close eye on support for the minor parties. The Liberal Democrats and also Reform UK have seen their support starting to creep up. So that's one of the things that could change. And then the other major factor, just following the conversation there, we see voters moving to Reform because they see immigration not being handled very well, but we also see the NHS and the economy as being really crucial, especially for those voters who might be switching Conservative Labour. So is there going to be something of an economic recovery that could reassure some of those undecided voters and maybe move them back into the Conservative fold.
All right.
There could also be a really decisive election campaign, that short campaign, because it strikes me that in this kind of period of disillusionment, many people have tuned out. And when we actually get the campaign, perhaps that's the moment that people will really start to make up their minds.
All right, Jane, stay with us. Henry, the mood in the Conservative Party, how many people have given up and are accepting defeat, and how many of those think some of the reasons outlined there by Jane are reasons to be hopeful?
I think there are grounds potentially to be hopeful that the polls could narrow before the election and you don't go down to a 20-point defeat. I don't think anyone outside Downing Street really thinks the next election is winnable. Not that I've found, anyway. Downing Street seems to, which frankly I find a bit baffling, because actually 20 points down in the polls with a majority is a great time to pass some awesome legislation if you don't care about, you know, you're not going to win the next election anyway. But no, like there are a few things, you know, the inflation is coming down and eventually the sort of the people adjust, expectations adjust to higher prices. If Nigel Farage doesn't come back to lead Reform, then I think that Reform's polling is a bit of an artefact. It never manifests in any by-elections. They don't have a ground machine. So I suspect a few points of that would probably end up back in the Tory column. So yeah, the polls could narrow, but no, I don't think there's really... You talk about an event. When are events good for governments, right? Normally, if there's a big news event, it's always a shock. But I'm trying to imagine, even hypothetically, the kind of event where everyone suddenly loves the government again. I don't know, maybe another
pandemic.
Another pandemic. God, maybe that would be it.
Oh, please. Alec, have you given up?
Good Lord, no. I think there has been an event, actually, and I think there is something which is going to change. I think the Liberal Democrats have a problem, and I think the problem is their leader. And I think him hiding away from the Commons when he was going to be in there, he was supposed to be presenting a bill and he didn't turn up. And, you know, this is a very emotive issue, what's happened in the post office.
Yeah. I mean, he was one post office minister, wasn't he? Or
he may have been, but that's where the attention has been focused. And I think, you know, we can argue about the rights and wrongs of that all day long, but in terms of the public perception, that is the name which is now fronting that. And I think that they are one of the events. I think the by-election comment is really interesting because I think that the headlines of the Tories have lost and there's been these big swings actually doesn't pick up on. I mean, Henry said that Reform aren't doing very much. But in most of those by-elections, the Tory voters have just stayed at home, whereas in the 90s, they voted Labour they switched.
You mentioned the 90s. Jane, can we get some historical context in terms of elections where a sustained, convincing lead in the polls has disappeared by polling day?
So you saw in 1990, 1991, Labour had a lead and then it was reduced again. And then, of course, the Conservatives won the election in 1992, to many people's surprise. That wasn't, you know, that was a longer time period beforehand. I think the other interesting historical parallel is to think about the Thatcher government in 1983 to 1987. And that was a period where a government improved its support. Now, that example is incredibly rare. I mean, if you look across countries, across elections, across time, governments that come into power and improve their polling position, that is very rare. And, you know, you asked the question before about what might change. I also agree with the panelists that, you know, what we're talking about here is a narrowing, not necessarily a reversal. So, you know, we're very, very close now to the election. So we haven't seen a change as dramatic as that, so close to an election.
No. All right.
The other interesting election to think about is 2017. And there we did see a narrowing during the campaign itself. So that was the Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn campaign. Theresa May's support reduced, her leadership ratings reduced, and many Labour voters who had sort of become undecided were reassured or at least disillusioned by what they saw in the Conservatives and moved back to Labour in that campaign. So that can start to, you know, those sorts of changes can happen.
Yes.
But reversals of fortunes, incredibly rare.
Well, let me just show Shami and Anoush this headline in The Guardian. Labour's poll lead could still collapse, shadow ministers warned. And it's from the party's chief strategist, Morgan McSweeney. According to The Guardian, he gave a presentation to the shadow cabinet using examples that we've just heard from recent elections and also in other countries, like Australia, for example, to show how support for a party can crumble right before an election. Does it keep you up at night?
It should, shouldn't it? I mean, goodness me, anyone who's lived through the last 8 years would counsel against complacency. It's been such a volatile period in our political history. I mean, it's very hard to fault the professor's analysis there. I couldn't fault a word of it. But this is certainly no time for complacency, including in the wider context of events around the world. We still have a political system where the incumbent Prime Minister has a few tricks up their sleeve, not just when to call the election, but you know, things.
Yes, I mean, when you're in power and in charge, you have those, don't you?
I think that Mr McSweeney was right to count. I remember the complacency of the Remain campaign in 2016. I remember some complacency amongst Democrats in the US before the first iteration of Trump. I don't think anything is a given.
Does anything need to change in the strategy, Anoush, in Labour's strategy, in order to secure and hold on to that lead? Because there is a suspicion that it will be the Ming vase. Just hold on to it carefully till the election. Or should they be more radical?
Well, that's clearly what they're doing. The Ming vase strategy has won out so far. You can see they're very careful. A lot of their policies just echo what the government's policies are on issues of the day. And so they're being quite careful not to say anything that will either make them stand out or give the Conservatives some kind of target. The danger in doing that is that Keir Starmer has developed a reputation as someone who is blowing with the wind. You know, that's why you often hear at PMQs accusations of, you know, Captain Hindsight, or, you know, he sits on the fence. And I think that is a danger to his reputation, and is probably on the mind of lots of those undecided voters who Jane was talking about.
Right. Do you think he should be more radical? Do you think it is to safety first?
Look, I understand that when you've got a government that is seen to be so incompetent, and when you've got a government that's been in power for such a long time...
And you're agreeing with keeping most of the policies?
Well, I certainly don't agree.
No, but the Labour.
Look, I can understand the competence argument, but you can't. I think you need a bit of a song in your heart to vote Labour as well. And I think, given what people in this country have been through in recent years, they need some hope of some sunny uplands, even to get out of bed to go and vote. I also think the party needs to be united, because come the election, you know, there are various. Not every broadcaster is as neutral and independent as the BBC. Oh. There are, you know, there are forces at play who will pull various tricks out of the bag to attack any Labour leader, even Keir Starmer. I think people need some hope as well as a belief in competence.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Jane. You'll be delighted to hear, and give us a prediction of the outcome of the next election.
So I'm not going to give you a prediction. One thing I did want to say is that what we're talking about here is obviously polling leads, but what we also need to bear in mind is how big a swing Labour needs in order to get a majority. So on a 12 percentage point swing, we're talking about, you know, given the geography and the electoral bias. So we're talking here about predictions about the polling. I'd be quite happy to talk about that. You know, I do expect this lead not to reverse, but I do expect there to be some change between now and election period, perhaps some narrowing. But the actual translation of votes to seats is what's really crucial here. And is that narrowing, if indeed there is a narrowing, and it's not an inevitable thing at all, because the government could lose more support over time, given the difficulties that it's got. Is that narrowing tipping us into kind of minority Labour government or into a majority Labour government? And that's the crucial question.
All right. Even though you resisted my tempting offer to have a prediction, Jane, thank you very much for joining us. Little prediction from you, perhaps, Henry? Could you be tempted?
Oh, God. My hunch was a Labour majority of 40 or 50, and then the SNP collapse started happening, so I'd probably say a Labour majority of 60, 70.
All right. No, well done for having a prediction. We won't hold you to it.
Well, I was going to say, I'll dig it out if it's right, and hopefully none of you...
Yes, of course. Well, we said we'd return to the issue of the Post Office and the miscarriage of justice for hundreds of sub-postmasters. Prime Minister's Questions is coming up in about 7 or 8 minutes' time. But what do the former sub-postmasters want to happen next? 9 of them and their relatives were on the BBC Breakfast Sofa this morning. Let's have a listen.
Speed up the compensation.
Maria? Yeah. Final redress for everybody.
Speed up the compensation.
Speed up the compensation. Mohammed, one thing.
Complete declaration of all these sub-postmasters are innocent at their offices, at their relative offices where they worked. Poster to say that post office have wrongly convicted them and they're sorry.
So public exoneration in each post office. Janet?
Accountability. I want accountability. I mean, compensation, people can't put a time frame on that, but it's accountability is what we need, and people need to be persecuted the same way we have.
Well, it's been unbelievably moving listening to the personal stories of untold suffering by the victims of this scandal. That's what they would like to hear from the government and see happen. Are they likely to get it? Let's talk to the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young. Vicky, what do we know?
It does seem that the way that the government is going here is with an Act of Parliament. As we heard there, this is about compensation. But of course, before you get to that point, you have to have the exoneration. So how does the government do that? Well, it was very clear yesterday that Justice Secretary was saying he wanted to exhaust all other avenues before they went down this route of an Act of Parliament. Now, the other avenues would have been, for example, a royal pardon, but that is really symbolic. That I just don't think will be enough for those who have been wrongly convicted. Speed up that appeals system. It does seem that the criminal justice system is incapable of doing it really quickly enough to satisfy everyone in all of this. So therefore, I think we will end up with that possibility of an Act of Parliament. Now, I think it is worth saying it's a huge step. Now, whether you can say it's unprecedented or not entirely sure. We've got people who've been working on this who are saying that in 1660 there was an Indemnity and Oblivion Act after the Civil War, the English Civil War, that gave pardons. Didn't apply to piracy and murder, though. But that's the only thing really that people can look to. So I think that does show the serious point here that it's a huge step, because some will see it as an attack on the independence of the courts. But I think the feeling in government is very much, look, this is an exceptional circumstance. It's a huge number of people, and because of that, and because of the failings that we've seen on so many different levels, that it might well be justified.
When do you think we'll hear anything?
It looks like Prime Minister's questions, maybe just in a few minutes. Rishi Sunak might be the one to make that announcement now. You know, Prime Ministers like to announce things when there is something to be done. You know, normally it would be the Justice Secretary or the Post Office Minister. I don't think that'll be the case. I think because there's such a public appetite and public interest in this now, that it's the Prime Minister who might want to announce that.
Yeah, Vicky, and we will see you shortly after Prime Minister's questions. In fact, we'll let you go to go and watch proceedings. Yes, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, will want to certainly be seen to be gripping this scandal, which has gained huge momentum since the TV drama was aired. Let me just show you, before we go into the chamber, this headline in the Financial Times. Fujitsu won contracts under Sunak's watch despite Post Office IT scandal. The Japanese supplier of the faulty Horizon IT system, they do have other contracts. Do you think the scandal is going to grow?
I think it's a very emotive story that is not over yet. I think just to bring this back to the real basics, this is a institutional failure of government. The Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Conservative Party have all been in power during this situation, and I think that is why we're in such an extraordinary moment.
Right. Do you think the government, though, should review contracts more widely or not award any further contracts to Fujitsu?
Well, I certainly think that we have to have the ability to look at all these contracts. Look, Fujitsu won't be the last government contract that fails. The question is have you got the ability going forward to identify that and do something about it? Because you think how long ago a Labour government was, and all governments since have been the problem.
They've been given contracts even in the last couple of years. It's totally outrageous. We debated this in the Lords last year.
Right.
And the postmasters wanted three things. They wanted exoneration, compensation, and accountability. Exoneration and compensation should come very quickly with emergency legislation. Accountability requires action against Fujitsu, including in relation to existing contracts, and new investigations and prosecutions of those involved in institutional corruption at Post Office Limited. They should be deprived the right to prosecute in the future. We need to look at their relationship with the United Kingdom state.
That is being looked at, of course, stripping the Post Office of its ability to prosecute. There are other public bodies, of course, who can do that too. Do you agree with that? And how do you change government's ability so they don't move like treacle through these issues?
Well, that's the big question. You know, all of these victims of miscarriages of justice, like the ones that I listed, speed was mentioned so many times by those postmasters. They really want governments to take them seriously when the issue arises, rather than having to wait for, say, an ITV drama or an endless inquiry to come to its conclusions.
Inquiries are abused. They're used as long grass.
Yeah.
And that's something we need to address in the future, whoever's in power.
Do you think it will be addressed, though, whoever's in power?
Well, I'm saying that I will play my part in that, whether my party's in power or not. Public inquiries have been abused to kick political issues into the long grass by a political class that doesn't respect the law or judges or lawyers in a normal turn of events.
We can just see in the corner of the screen Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, waiting to take his seat, possibly for an announcement. Do you think things will really change?
Not in terms of public inquiries. Like, there's a vast problem. The way we do public inquiries is extremely slow, expensive. It lets stories die. But on the other hand, if you wanted, I've advocated for changing the way we do public inquiries, but that would involve completely changing how we do them, and that would mean, you know, less catharsis, less judicial inquiry. If you want to get rid of the fact that everyone lawyers up and gives testimony, then maybe you need to make it black box and have... There's all kinds of problems with the way we do inquiries, but the inquiries are like that for a reason, because everyone has demands, and an inquiry that fits all of them is undeliverable.
Let's just go into the chamber, because we might be about time for the Speaker.
Come on, please, sir. Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Anders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year to you. Now then, the Horizon Post Office scandal saw hundreds of innocent people sent to prison. People like a former constituent of mine who went to jail for 3 years. Now, during this scandal, the leader of the Liberal Democrats was the minister in charge of the Post Office. In charge of the Post Office. This is the same Liberal Democrat leader who in the past has called for the resignation of over 30 prominent people in this country who have made mistakes in their job. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that the leader of the Lib Dem should take his own advice and start by clearing his desk, clear his diary and clear off? Mr. Speaker, this is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history. People who worked hard to serve their communities had their lives and their reputations destroyed through absolutely no fault of their own. The victims must get justice and compensation. Sir Win Williams' inquiry is undertaking crucial work to expose what went wrong, and we've paid almost £150 million in compensation to over 2,500 victims. But today I can announce that we will introduce new primary legislation to make sure that those convicted as a result of the Horizon scandal are swiftly exonerated and compensated. We will also introduce a new upfront payment of £75,000 for the vital GLO group of postmasters. And can I thank my honourable friend, the member for Thurston Moulton, for all his hard work on this issue. He will set out more details to the House shortly. We will make sure that the truth comes to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and the victims get the justice they deserve.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard what the Prime Minister just said about the Post Office scandal. It is a huge injustice. People lost their lives, their liberty and their livelihood, and they've been waiting far too long for the truth, for justice and for compensation. So I'm glad the Prime Minister is putting forward a proposal. We will look at the details, and I think it's the job of all of us to make sure that it delivers the justice that is so needed. Mr. Speaker, back in 2022, when Boris Johnson claimed he would send asylum seekers to Rwanda, one ambitious Tory MP had reservations. He agreed with Labour that it wouldn't work. It was a waste of money. It was the latest in a long line of gimmicks. Does the Prime Minister know what happened to that MP?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what that honourable gentleman refers to is a document that he hasn't seen, I haven't seen, and has been reported second-hand in a bunch of media newspapers. But what I can tell him is, I am absolutely clear that you do need to stop the boats, and that's what this government and that MP is going to deliver.
I notice he didn't deny it, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised. £400 million of taxpayer money down the drain. No one sent to Rwanda. Small boats still coming. It's hardly a surprise he wanted to scrap the scheme when he was trying to sneak in as Tory leader. But he's been caught red-handed opposing the very thing that he's now made his flagship policy. Which member should we listen to? The one before us today or the one who used to believe in something?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've always been crystal clear. You do need to have an effective deterrence to finally solve this problem. In fact, the National Crime Agency agree that you need, in their words, an effective removals and deterrence agreement. And that's why, after becoming Prime Minister, I negotiated a new deal with Albania, thanks to which we have seen a 93% drop in illegal arrivals from Albania. That's how Australia stopped the boats. That's why Italy, Germany and Austria are all looking at similar schemes. He's the only one who's opposed to a proper deterrent. Not because it doesn't work, because he doesn't actually believe in controlling migration, Mr. Speaker. Every single time he picks the people smugglers over the British people.
Mr. Speaker, we should smash the gangs, process the claims and end hotel use. That's our plan. And unlike the Prime Minister, I believe in it. But...
I'm going to hear the questions. I don't want interruptions, please. It's very important. It's a very important topic, and I take it seriously. I hope members also wish to start taking it seriously. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, last year he started the year saying he was Mr. Steady. Then at his conference he was Mr. Change. Now he's flipped back to Mr. More of the same. Doesn't matter how many relaunches, flip-flops he does, he'll always be Mr. Nobody. And here's the tragedy of his leadership. He spends the whole time trying to convince people not to believe their own eyes, pretending that debt is falling, that the economy is going gangbusters, the NHS is in great shape. When he finally finds something he was right about, the Rwanda gimmick, he can't even take credit for it. When's he going to stop pretending that up is down, that black is white, admit that whether it's the economy, immigration, the NHS, he has failed?
Mr. Speaker, well, let's just go through his checklist. He talks about the backlog, 112,000 decisions made last year, a higher number than in any year in the past 2 decades, Mr. Speaker. He talked about hotels. Well, the first 50 are being closed and there are more to come, Mr. Speaker. He talks about the numbers. Well, they were down by over a third last year, Mr. Speaker, the first time that's happened. And then he talked, Mr. Speaker, he talked about smashing the gangs. Well, if he does care about smashing the gangs, why doesn't he own up to the fact that when it came to the Nationality and Borders Act, he blocked, delayed and voted against the powers in that act, which have allowed us to now arrest hundreds and hundreds of people connected with that illegal trade who have been sentenced to hundreds of years in prison. He opposed that because he chooses the criminal gangs over the British people every time.
I don't think we are. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we can all see what's happened here. Just like he knows that debt isn't falling and taxes are going up, he knows the Rwanda gimmick won't work. But he can't be honest about it because he's too scared of his own MPs. Doesn't he wish he'd stuck to his guns rather than to allow himself to be taken hostage by his own party?
Mr. Speaker, we're debating this because we have taken a stand and we're delivering the toughest migration plan ever to end the legal challenges and actually get flights off the ground. And let's be clear about this. He doesn't have a single practical idea about how to stop the boats. But that's because he doesn't actually care about controlling migration. This is a person who described all immigration law as racist, Mr. Speaker. He thinks limits on economic migration are, in his words, economic vandalism. It didn't even feature once in his 5 missions, and he didn't mention it once in his conference speech. The truth is, he's pro-free movement, he's anti-border control, and he can never be trusted to stop the boats.
I think we should smash the gangs. And I spent 5 years of my life doing exactly. This is the party that's lost control of the borders. And whilst he's tending to the Tory party, the country is left without government. Yes. A collapse in dentistry, leaving people literally pulling out their own teeth. Flood defences completely exposed. Hundreds of thousands of children still out of school. His government appears blissfully uninterested in what's going on outside the walls of Westminster. Does he realise how ludicrous it looks when he spends his time boasting whilst Britain is breaking?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad he brought up our schools, because there's nothing more important than ensuring our children get a world-class education, and that's why I'm pleased that, in spite of Labour opposing every reform that we made, our children are now the best readers in the Western world, Mr. Speaker. But he's right that attendance is important, and that's why we're investing millions of pounds more to provide support for absent pupils. We launched a national campaign, and just this week, we've doubled the number of attendance hubs to support over 1,000 at the most vulnerable schools. But I am surprised to hear him raise that topic, because from longer lockdowns or voting against our minimum service laws, his priority has always been keeping our children out of school, Mr. Speaker. It's always the same with him. There's no plan. It's just peddling one thing to his union friends and another thing to the British people.
New year, new nonsense. Every week he stands here and tells the country they should be thanking him, not questioning him. Point out that the view on the ground is very different to that from his private jet, and he says, you're talking the country down. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't get what a cost of living crisis feels like. He doesn't know any schools where kids no longer turn up, and he doesn't understand what it's like to wait for a hospital appointment. Doesn't the country deserve so much better than a Prime Minister who simply doesn't get Britain?
Mr. Speaker, well, from the last week we had, I say, yet another half-hour speech from the honourable gentleman, and what a surprise, yet again, it didn't contain a single new idea. We've had 4 years of him as Labour leader, and it's still all slogan, no plan, Mr. Speaker. Now, just this weekend, Mr. Speaker, just this weekend, we're delivering on our plan to cut people's taxes, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't have a plan. We've got a plan to stop the boats. He doesn't have a plan. And we've got a plan to get people off welfare and into work. He doesn't have a single idea. It's crystal clear, Mr. Speaker. Stick with us to deliver the long-term change that the country needs. Don't go back to square one with him.
Let him ask the question before you shout for more. Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just know it's going to be fantastic. And a Happy New Year to you, anyway. It's almost spring when a young man's fancy turns to tax. In Scotland, the Nationalists have decided to increase taxes on hard-working people. And in Wales, businesses are being clobbered by a 5% increase on rates. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? There's only one party in this chamber that can be trusted to cut taxes for hard-working people across the country, and that's the Conservatives.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We are now just this weekend, Mr. Speaker, for an average person in work, cutting their taxes by £450, Mr. Speaker. In Wales, where Labour are in charge, they're raising them, with businesses there now seeing double the rate of business rates this year, Mr. Speaker. And it's the same in Scotland under the SNP, the new high-tax capital of the United Kingdom, because of the SNP's tax hiking decisions. So, Mr. Speaker, while we've got a plan and cutting your taxes, it's Labour and the SNP that are going to raise them.
The SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, a horizon system introduced by Tony Blair, the former Labour Party leader and, of course, now a Knight's Garter. A Horizon system defended by the current leader of the Liberal Democrats, himself a Knight bachelor. A Horizon system scandal overseen by a former Conservative Prime Minister who now hides in the House of Lords as a baron. The reality is that sub-postmasters never stood a chance against the Westminster establishment, did they?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, this is actually one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our country's history. And all our thoughts are with those who worked so hard for their communities and have seen their lives and reputations destroyed. And since this scandal, as the Honourable Gentleman pointed out, has actually unfolded over decades and with multiple people clearly at fault. But since 2019 in the High Court case, this government established a statutory inquiry led by Sir Wyn Williams to uncover what went wrong, established an independent advisory board, and has established 3 different compensation schemes, paying out £150 million to over 2,500 people, with now almost 2/3 having received final compensation. But we must go further and faster, Mr. Speaker, which is why we have made new announcements today.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think the Prime Minister quite gets it. This isn't just a plague on all their houses. This is a plague on this House itself, because injustice goes far beyond just the sub-postmasters. Just ask the Waspy women, or the victims of the Equitable Life scandal, or the victims of the infected blood scandal, or the victims' families from Grenfell or Hillsborough. The reality is that when the public come knocking on the doors of this here chamber seeking justice, the government only ever answers when they have no options left. Now, the Leader of the Opposition said last week that the public are right to be angry at Westminster, and they are angry at Westminster. They're angry at Westminster because they know that this place never really changes. Does it, Prime Minister?
No, Mr. Speaker. This is... and actually, I am sad that the Honourable Gentleman is trying to politicise something that has happened over multiple decades, with multiple people at fault. But the key thing is, after the 2019 High Court case, the government did act to establish an independent inquiry, independent compensation schemes, and as I said, has paid out compensation to 2,500 people. But rather than trying to politicise it, what we should be doing is focusing on the people affected and making sure that they get the answers, justice and compensation that they deserve, and that is what we are delivering.
I made a promise to a granddad in my constituency after he told me he hadn't dared speak up when his grandson came home saying, "Today we were learning if we were in the wrong body." Draft Schools guidance to support gender questioning children has now been published just before Christmas, and it's out to public consultation. But when we've all seen many individual people very publicly cancelled, lost their jobs, their reputation, their relationships, for simply supporting biological reality or championing fairness, women's safety, child protection, can I ask my right honourable friend, how will honest and open engagement be managed through this very important and sensitive consultation process?
Can I thank my honourable friend for her important question and assure her that she's right about the safety and well-being of children being paramount in our thoughts, and that is at the heart of the guidance that we have published for consultation. But also, Mr. Speaker, parents fundamentally must be involved in decisions about their children's lives, and their involvement is a key part of this guidance. She's right to say there's a consultation process. That is an opportunity for everyone to engage with this guidance, and she's also right to say, and I agree with her, that those championing safety or indeed talking about the importance of biological sex should absolutely have the freedom to express those views, and she will see those views expressed in the guidance too.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Prime Minister for the £3.3 billion financial package which is now available to any restored Northern Ireland executive. However, we still need a discussion around the long-term financial framework before the next spending review. At present, Northern Ireland is seeing its public services in huge crisis, especially health, and there are urgent public sector pay pressures which must be addressed. Last month, the Secretary of State said that the negotiations with the DUP over the Windsor framework have concluded. Does the Prime Minister recognise the real dangers of continued drift in Northern Ireland and the urgent need for Northern Ireland to have a government?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question? Our focus has always been on delivering for the people of Northern Ireland, who rightly expect and deserve their locally elected decision makers to address the issues that matter to them. We have held talks with the DUP and believe that significant progress has been made and that there is now a very good basis for the executive to be restored. I thank him for his comments about the £3 billion financial package, and with that there is a real chance to restore the executive, resolve pay for public sector workers rapidly and get Northern Ireland and its public services moving again.
James Grundy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Atherley Way bypass in Lee was first proposed over 60 years ago, but to this day remains unfinished. I recently met with representatives of Wigan, Warrington and St Helens Council, as well as the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and I'm pleased to say an agreement in principle has been reached to bring forward proposals to complete the bypass. Would the Prime Minister also like to throw his support behind this vital project for my constituents in Lee?
Well, can I commend my honourable friend for all his work bringing local authorities and the Mayor together to drive this important project forward. I know that my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, is meeting with my honourable friend to discuss this proposal and ensure that we can deliver things like this. And as part of Network North, there will be significant new funding announced for local highway improvements. And I would encourage my honourable friend to work with stakeholders to progress this important scheme and ensure that they can bid for that funding when it becomes available.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister very simply, for the public record, whether he personally met Mr. Akhil Tripathi in April last year, prior to Mr. Tripathi giving him £38,000 for the hire of a private jet?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all my declarations are made in the usual way, according to the usual processes.
Whip's question. The Prime Minister knows that I set up and chair the caucus of 35 Conservative members of Parliament who have Britain's longest river flowing through their constituencies, the River Severn. We've submitted a business case to the Chancellor for £500 million to finally tame the River Severn, and I know that his officials are currently looking at those proposals. To tame the River Severn will lead to a GVA uplift in the West Midlands of over £150 billion. The Prime Minister has seen this week the horrendous damage and misery caused in Shropshire and all the way along the River Severn of this river flooding yet again. We really do need to see now in this spring budget further assistance for communities like mine to finally deal with these annual floods.
Can I start by saying that my thoughts are with all those affected by the devastating impact of Storm Henk and the flooding we've seen over the past week or two, including those in my honourable friend's constituency. Action is already being undertaken under our 6-year, £5.2 billion investment programme to better protect land across the River Severn catchment area and elsewhere. But I know that the Flooding Minister met my honourable friend along with the Environment Agency in his constituency just before Christmas to discuss the specific plans he mentions. I know the Chancellor has received and has started reviewing it. I can assure him that the Environment Agency is working closely with other partners to explore his plans in more detail further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the outbreak of war in Gaza, over 23,000 Palestinians have been killed, including 10,000 children, and forced displacement is causing a humanitarian catastrophe. There's intensifying fighting between Hezbollah and Israel, a crisis in shipping security in the Red Sea, and the engulfing of neighbouring countries into a regional conflict. De-escalation will only occur when hostilities cease in Gaza. The Foreign Secretary yesterday said he was worried Israel may have broken international law, and the International Court of Justice is opening hearings in The Hague this week in relation to suspected breaches of obligations under the Geneva Convention. Will the Prime Minister make public legal advice our government requested and received on suspected breaches of international law by Israel and the implications for UK policy, including relevant arms exports?
Mr. Speaker, we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and civilians to be protected, and that is what our current legal assessments say is happening. And as the Foreign Secretary outlined yesterday, that Israel plans to act within international humanitarian law and has the ability to do so. But we are also deeply concerned about the impact on civilian population in Gaza. That's why we've trebled the amount of aid that we provide to the region. And just recently, we sent our first maritime shipment of aid to Egypt. A UK military ship delivered over 80 tons of new blankets and life-saving medical equipment for Gaza. And we are working with Jordan to find more land routes. We will continue to do everything we can to support the vulnerable people who are being impacted by what's happening on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Stop your ears. In my constituency, the new Hillingdon Hospital has full planning permission, has full funding, and enabling works is well underway. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that this new state-of-the-art hospital will uplift the health benefits for the residents of Uxbridge and South Ruislip? And will he join me in visiting the project site at a time where his diary allows?
My honourable friend has been a fantastic campaigner for the new Hillingdon Hospital, and I agree with him that it will provide fantastic care to him and his constituents as well. And I'm pleased that planning permission and funding has now been granted for the site and work is progressing. I will look at my diary, but in the meantime I can tell him that my honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will be very happy to come and visit my honourable friend's project and see the significant progress for herself.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, my constituents had to wait months for an election to finally be confirmed, with uncertainty repeatedly prolonged, seemingly out of self-interest. Now, this year, out of all people, I didn't expect the Prime Minister to be turning to my predecessor for strategic inspiration. If we're going to be waiting, I hope we can work together for a group in my constituency that really deserve support. Will the Prime Minister meet with some fantastic kinship carers in mid-Bedfordshire to talk through how we can progress the strategy, make it go further, faster, and crucially, why Bedfordshire might be a fantastic place for one of the proposed pilot areas?
Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to all kinship carers for the incredible work they do. I'll be very happy to review the plans that the honourable gentleman mentioned and make sure that ministers have a look at them too. And as I said, pay tribute to all of those in his constituency and elsewhere that are doing a terrific job. And in government, as he knows, we are looking at ways we can support them further, and we'll continue to do that.
Deborah Miller.
The Prime Minister knows that in Basingstoke we also need a new hospital, and that's why he's given £900 million for our hospital trust to make that happen. Does my right honourable friend agree that this is a once-in-a-lifetime investment and must modernise not just the NHS healthcare that's provided, but also support his plan to double medical training places by 2031? And we're also ready to build our hospital a bit quicker if that helps.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that through our new hospitals programme, Hampshire's Hospital Trust, the NHS Foundation, will receive significant investment to ensure that excellent care is available for her and all her constituents. I think the Trust started their consultation last year and the results are due at the end of March, and we'll look forward to making sure that we can deliver this project as quickly as possible as part of the record capital investment in the NHS to deliver faster, better care to patients everywhere.
Happy New Year, Mr. Speaker.
Happy New Year.
Reports suggest that the Prime Minister's family investment company, Catamaran Ventures, is being wound up, and that his wife's is exiting her interests in her childcare company, Koru Kids. So will the Prime Minister keep his promise to the Liaison Committee, which includes a number of Conservative MPs, and confirm whether or not he has forgotten to register any of his financial interests? And will he publish all details of Catamaran Ventures investments?
Mr. Speaker, I take very seriously my responsibilities to register and declare all of my relevant interests. All of them have been declared in accordance with the ministerial code, and it is the role of the independent advisor to advise on what is necessary to publish within that list, including in the case of ministers' family members. And when specific questions are asked in things like liaison committee, as I have been in dialogue with the committee, declarations are made on top of that, which I have made, and as I made from the dispatch box, my wife has been an investor in British companies over the past years, but that is now something that she has ceased to do further going forward.
Anna Firth.
Speaker,
New, very large shellfish beds have been discovered in the Thames estuary, including razor clams and manila clams, both highly prized around the world. So will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating local fisherman, Mr Paul Gilson, on his proactive work? And will he come to Leigh-on-Sea, meet my local fishermen, so we can discuss how to maximise this brilliant Brexit bonus for Essex fishermen?
Well, can I join my honourable friend in welcoming this fantastic discovery? We have been capitalising on the benefits of Brexit since we left the EU, and we're making sure that we can transform opportunity in the UK, particularly in fishing communities. I know my honourable friend, the Minister for Farming and Fishing, will be happy to meet with her to discuss what more this could mean. And I hope I also have an opportunity to come and see her and see this incredible discovery for myself too.
Hamilton. I was a nurse in our NHS for 25 years. It is an offence to my colleagues and our patients when the Prime Minister pretends he's got a grip on NHS waiting times. Despite his big pledge to cut them, they've risen by 500,000 in the last year alone. He can blame striking all he likes, but after 14 years of Tories, who can possibly say that NHS is better off?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable lady for her decades of service in the NHS and commend all the work of our fantastic, hard-working nurses in the NHS. And I'm pleased that we've delivered early on our manifesto pledge to have 50,000 more nurses in the NHS, together with record numbers of doctors, elective surgical hubs, community diagnostic centres, all of which means that we are now treating more people in the NHS than we have ever done before. One thing that is hampering progress on tackling the waiting list is obviously industrial action. So I hope that the honourable lady can join with the million NHS workers, including nurses, midwives, therapists, paramedics, consultants and specialty doctors, all of whom have reached a fair and reasonable pay settlement with the government, and urge the junior doctors to do the same.
Andrew Percy.
We're leaving Prime Minister's questions at this point because we will return to the Chamber for the expected statement from the Post Office Minister, Kevin Hollinrake. He will give details, we hope, on what the Prime Minister announced at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions, that the government will introduce primary legislation to swiftly exonerate and compensate those who were wrongly prosecuted and convicted by the Post Office. Let's introduce our guests, starting with the government's Minister, Justice Minister Edward Argar, the Shadow Paymaster General Jonathan Ashworth, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young. Vicky, what does that mean?
I mean, it's a big step. This is Parliament, an Act of Parliament saying that hundreds of people will have their convictions overturned. Now, it is pretty unprecedented. You know, I don't think anyone can really remember a moment when this has happened. And, you know, there's definitely some concern in government about doing this because it is such a significant step. But I think the view is that this is a very exceptional circumstance. It's been going on, as we know, a very, very long time. And that's why this action is justified. I think it's worth saying there are dozens, hundreds of MPs who have been campaigning on this for a very long time. It's not true that Westminster didn't know about this, hasn't done anything about it. There is a public inquiry, but it's all been too slow. It has left so many people, as we've seen, with their lives ruined. And it does just go to show that when the eyes of the country are focused on an issue, how quickly the wheels of government can move.
Well, we'll discuss that a little later on in the programme. When swiftly exonerate, how swiftly do we think it's going to be, Edward?
Well, I suspect, first of all, this has been, as Vicky highlighted, a dreadful scandal with devastating impacts on people up and down this country. And quite rightly, I think there is a clear cross-party determination to redress this and to take swift action. What you've seen the Prime Minister just announce will be primary legislation to quash all those convictions of those who were wrongfully convicted.
So to quash them, not a pardon, to quash the convictions.
That's my understanding, but I think you'll get a little bit more probably in about 10 minutes of your viewers on that and potentially on the timings of that. I don't know what Kevin Hollinrake is about to stand up and say in response to it, but you've seen a clear direction of travel and a clear urgency in what the Prime Minister's set out today, and that's absolutely right in the circumstances.
And you support and back all this. I mean, Keir Starmer says he wants to look at the details. He didn't say much more in response to the announcement. What's your reaction?
Well, the Horizon post office scandal is arguably, most definitely, the worst miscarriage of justice in history. And I watched the TV series over Christmas, like many of your viewers would have done. I mean, I cried. Yeah. I mean, I cried, but also my blood absolutely boiled at what we saw going on. So we want to see swift exoneration, compensation sped up. Obviously, we've just had a very summary announcement from the Prime Minister. I'm not criticising the Prime Minister for that. I'm just saying it's the nature of PMQs. And we obviously all want to look at the details very carefully, obviously. Yes. But we do want to see swift exoneration. Of course we do.
I mean, you cried. I think most people did when they watched it. And yet we've all known about this scandal for a long, long time. I mean, Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, was right. It was a real failure, isn't it, of Parliament, of Westminster, of not gripping this much, much earlier. I know there have been some schemes set up, there have been some convictions overturned, but broadly, it's taken a TV drama to bring the government to this stage.
Well, I think this is something we know it's been going on since 1999.
Yeah, successive governments. I'll come on to Labour.
And that's not, I hasten to add, that's not a party political point in any way. This is governments of all political complexions. We've saw the public inquiry set up. This is something, and you'll have heard Kevin Hollingrake on the BBC this morning highlighting, this is something that he's been working on. His predecessor, Paul Scully, who is a regular on
this he was
programme,
on earlier in the week.
Has been working on this for many years. Yeah. There are complexities, which is what we've seen with the overturning of the convictions. The route that was gone down was each one going to court to be overturned. I think 93 have been overturned. Yeah. But you're absolutely right to say that drama, that programme, had a huge emotional impact on people and brought it into people's homes. It was, you know, Toby Jones is an amazing actor, and conveyed it in a way that, in truth, neither you, however good a journalist you are, Jonathan and I as politicians, wouldn't have been able to do in terms of the resonance. So I think that has brought it home to the country. But it's wrong to say that there hasn't been anything done before, because there's been a lot of work on this, and over 148 million, I think, already paid out. There's a lot more to do, and that's why we need to do it.
At a snail's pace. Would you accept it is failure of the political class?
I wouldn't put it in those terms. Which terms would you put it in? You're absolutely right. The programme has had a galvanising effect on Westminster, and that is a good thing. And we do need to ask questions as to why the political class, the Westminster world, has not as moved at the pace that your viewers are now rightly demanding. But MPs have been working on this on a cross-party basis. There is a public inquiry. There are questions as to why, when the Court of Appeal overturned or quashed convictions a couple of years ago, that the criminal justice system did not move more swiftly on some of these issues. I'm not a lawyer, so there may well be very good judicial reasons for that, but I think there are questions around that need asking. There are now serious questions also around some of the procurement decisions that have been taking place. But again, that's why a public inquiry has been set up, to get to the bottom of some of these very complicated decisions that have gone on over a long time period.
Do you think that when a public inquiry is set up, part of the problem is, although that's a good thing and it will go through things in a very methodical way, they take years, don't they? And so that in some ways slows down the process.
Yeah, I mean, there is a genuine question there, an issue around public inquiries and the timeframes, and you know, we see that with so many different public inquiries, but they do have to be methodical. They do have to. Public inquiries, by their nature, can end up with some very damning judgments about the behaviour and the decisions of individuals. So it's understandable that they would want to really interrogate and scrutinise every single piece of evidence that comes their way. But look, if there's practical proposals out there how public inquiries can be made quicker in the round, then of course politicians should look at them.
Because what happens, or we've seen what happened in this drama, what happens to those people waiting? Lives are ruined. People die while they wait for justice. And so the idea that that is and has proven to be an effective way to tackle these miscarriages of justice is beginning to sort of wear thin. And I totally take your point. Of course, public inquiries are there for a reason, and we have to follow processes. But for those people waiting, it took so long to get the ear of MPs, yes, but to raise it up the political agenda.
Well, I think Jonathan makes a very good point. Public inquiries do serve a particular purpose, which will hopefully be to hold individuals and corporations potentially to account. I don't want to prejudge what that inquiry will do. And that's why it needs to go through everything very, very carefully, because there may well be legal consequences arising from what Sir Wynne finds in the context of that. So it's important that that takes place. But you're right, it's also important that while that's happening, there is the ability for people to exonerate themselves or to get redress. And that's why the interim payment scheme was set up. That's why we've seen some convictions overturned. But you're right, the legal process is a lengthy and a complex one in terms of appeals. I think it's 93 have been successfully appealed and overturned, but that still leaves just shy of 900 or so, I think, by my arithmetic, still waiting. And that's why the Prime Minister has set out what he's going to do, because it's quite right. And we heard, I think, this morning on various of the media outlets, people saying, being asked what they want, and they said speed.
Yes.
It's gone on too long and speed. And I can understand that, both with the impact it's had on people's lives, but also the sense of being powerlessness. We saw in that drama, there was one particular bit that resonates with me, where there was a lady who was on the phone, and they were saying, oh, here's what you do to reconcile it, did it, and it doubled. And the response down the phone was, well, you're responsible. And that encapsulates, I suspect, the sense of the powerlessness of these individuals against what they were up against.
The lady in question, I think, was Jo Hamilton, one of the former sub-postmistresses who was played by Monica Dolan in the ITV drama. We can talk to her while we're waiting for Kevin Hollinrake. Jo, welcome to you. What an ordeal. What a long haul for you and your colleagues and other sub-postmasters. What did you make of what the Prime Minister said at the beginning of PMQs?
You can probably see steam coming out of my ears. It beggars belief that he said he's going to throw £75,000 at the group. And in my case, I was criminalised. So I had a chance to go to the Court of Appeal, clear my name and join the overturned conviction scheme. So we had chunks of money, substantial chunks of money, because in my case, I actually Post Office stole from me £60,000. And the interest on everything I've given them, it comes to around £100,000. The £75,000, these people that weren't convicted, but literally lost everything, £75,000 won't even pay the interest on the debt they're in, because I know what it's like. I've been there.
No, absolutely.
They need proper interim payment, not 75,000. These are people who've lost their homes, they've lost their businesses and everything. They might not have had a criminal conviction, but they've lost every bit as much as I did. And I just think it's wicked. We have fought for decades and we win in the High Court, and they're still trying to get money out of the government, who just we've due process.
Jo, just stay with us, because we're waiting to see if the Post Office Minister, Kevin Hollinrake, has taken his seat in the House of Commons chamber to give more detail. Here he is. We'll come back to you.
As the Prime Minister indicated a few minutes ago, I'm informing the House about further steps the government is taking to address the Horizon scandal. The government is taking measures to speed the flow of compensation. We have already set a target of issuing initial offers for 90% of group litigation order cases within 40 days of receiving a completed application. And I announced in November that we would be introducing a £600,000 upfront offer for claims with overturned convictions, which people could choose to take rather than going through the detailed assessment process. This has already made a real difference. Before my announcement, only 5 of those people had reached full and final settlements. I can now report that with the help of the minimum payment, we have finalised 30 cases. This has obviously speeded up matters along for those who have taken this upfront offer. It's also helped those who have chosen individual assessment, because resources can be concentrated on those cases. I can announce today that we are taking similar measures in respect of the group litigation order scheme. We will now make people in that scheme an upfront offer of £75,000, which will save them having to go through a full assessment. But, as with overturned convictions, if they believe they're entitled to more, they are welcome to continue with the full assessment. Not only will this allow the Department to focus its resources on the larger cases, it will allow claimants' lawyers to do the same. The pace at which we can get claims into the scheme is the key constraint on how quickly we can settle them. The upfront offer is smaller for the GLO scheme than for the overturned convictions because the claims tend to be smaller. We estimate that perhaps a third of GLO claimants may want to consider this route. I'm sure the House will welcome this measure. When I made my statement on Monday, I heard all parts of the House share my desire to ensure justice for postmasters who have been convicted of offences as part of the scandal. The whole House is united on this, and I believe that in the light of last week's excellent ITV series, I think the whole nation is united on it too. We've all been moved by the stories of postmasters who have been unjustly convicted and the terrible effects over a period of 2 decades of their finances, their health and their relationships. Indeed, we have seen whole lives ruined by this brutal and arbitrary exercise of power. Hundreds of convictions remain extant. Some of those convictions will have relied on the evidence of the discredited Horizon system. Others will have been the result of appalling failures of the Post Office's investigation and prosecution functions. The evidence, which is already emerging from Sir Wyn Williams' inquiry, has shown not only incompetence but malevolence in many of their actions. This was evidence which was not available to the courts when they made their decisions on individual cases. So far, 95 of over 900 convictions have been overturned. We know that postmasters have been reluctant to apply to have their convictions overturned. Many of them have decided that they've been through enough and they cannot face further engagement with authority. Many fear having their hopes raised only to be dashed yet again. The Horizon Compensation Advisory Board has recommended that we should overturn all the convictions of the postmasters who were prosecuted in the Horizon scandal. I think their motivation for doing so is absolutely right, and we will work with them to speed up the process. Can I put on record my thanks to Lord Arbuthnot, who's in the gallery today, and also the Right Honourable Member for North Durham for their work on this campaign generally and on that advisory board. Following their recommendation would involve quite unprecedented action by Parliament to overturn specific verdicts of the courts. The Government, of course, completely recognises the importance of an independent court system and judiciary. So this recommendation raises important issues of constitutional principle. This is therefore not a decision we can take lightly. It also creates the risks of a different sort of injustice. I'm sure that a great many people were wrongly convicted in this scandal, but I cannot tell the House that all of those prosecuted were indeed innocent, or even that it was 90% or 80 or 70. Without retrying every case, we cannot know. So the risk is that instead of unjust convictions, we shall end up with unjust acquittals, and we just do not know how many. The only way we could tell would be to put all cases through the courts, further dragging out the distress for many innocent people.
Order. Can I just say, this is a very important issue. I'm going to allow the Minister to continue, but I'm going to say to the opposition, your time also increases with the others, and to Sir David as well. It is important and too important an issue to curtail it, but I would say to officials, they really ought to be aware that when they do provide speeches, it is for 3 minutes. But I do want you to fulfil this because the issue is far, far too important. Minister.
Can I thank you for that, Mr. Speaker, and I apologise for the length of this statement, this urgent response to the urgent question, but it is, as you say, of vital importance. So we have been faced with a dilemma: either accept the present problem of many people carrying the unjustified slur of conviction, or accept that an unknown number of people who have genuinely stolen from their post office will be exonerated and perhaps even compensated. I can therefore announce that we intend to bring forward legislation as soon as we can to overturn the convictions of all those convicted in England or Wales on the basis of post office evidence given during the Horizon scandal. The Government will, in the coming days, consider whether to include the small number of cases that have already been considered by the appeal courts and the convictions upheld. We recognise this is an exceptional step, but these are exceptional circumstances. As the House knows, people with convictions which have been overturned are offered a choice between having their compensation individually assessed or settling on an upfront offer of £600,000. So as far as possible, we want to avoid guilty people walking away with hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money. But we cannot make the provision of compensation subject to a detailed examination of guilt. Because we have concluded that to do so would be unfair to individuals to ask the court to do that again. And we cannot turn this into an administrative exercise. So all we ask is that as part of their claims of compensation, postmasters sign a statement to the effect they did not commit the crimes of which they're accused. Anyone subsequently found to have signed such a statement untruthfully will be putting themselves at risk of prosecution or fraud. I do not pretend to the House that this is a foolproof device.
We will leave it there in the Commons chamber. Kevin Hollinrake giving a pretty lengthy statement with quite a lot of detail about how the legislation will work, what it will do, but also outlining that this wasn't taken lightly, this decision, because it is a pretty unprecedented step for Parliament, for the government to overturn independent court decisions. He said, but they are going to go ahead with that legislation as soon as we can. So I don't know exactly when that will be in England and Wales to exonerate all those convicted, with a risk, he says, that there could be a number, he doesn't know how many, who are acquitted and who are not innocent. Let's return to Joe Hamilton. Joe, what do you make of what you've heard from Kevin Hollinrake?
Well, it's amazing what they can do when they have to. But the fact is, regardless of all the overturning of all the convictions, the groups still haven't been paid. And there's 75,000. I mean, there should be a naught on the end. They've trashed people's lives. I'm angry about that the group that literally have fought, we got our GLO, we started the GLO route in 2015, and we're now in 2024. And that's what they're offering them, you know, when they've lost more than that in the first place.
Well, Joe,
it's staggering.
Well, Joe, we have a government minister here, Edward Arger. Do you want to respond that actually £75,000, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but when you put it in the context of what Joe and her fellow postmasters and mistresses have been through, it goes nowhere.
Well, I can entirely understand where Joe's coming from on that, both from the tales we've heard from, what we've heard from postmasters in real life, but also what we saw in that dramatisation of it and what people went through, and that some will have subsequently died or taken their own lives, in fact, in this context. And she's also right to highlight, I think it's around just over 950, a bit higher than that, who were convicted, but there were thousands who weren't convicted of a crime but still had to pay back money that they hadn't actually stolen, so suffered financially as well. So she's absolutely right in that. What I think, and I've just heard the details of this as you have, as John has, when Kevin set them out there. I think what he was saying there is it's £75,000 for those who want to take that up front, but there is the option
to apply.
For people to apply to go through the assessment process. And I think he said, and as I say, I listened to it in real time with you and your viewers there, that they would aim to do that within 40 days. Yes. And that there was therefore an opportunity to assess that and potentially go, I would imagine, considerably higher to reflect the losses that assessment highlighted in individual cases.
Joe, you're saying it makes it worse. Yes, why?
Yeah, it does. It means it's 75 grand, take it or leave it, if that's what I'm hearing. But it also means this 40-day thing, they've said that, but in real life, I know of a lot of people that hasn't happened. They haven't turned it around in 40 days. And then in one instance, someone is arguing over £100 worth of expenses to go to probation for a year. And then they put government lawyers on it to work out whether they're entitled to the £100. It's like, for goodness sake, it's not. I find it staggering. I'm so frustrated that after all the fighting, we still don't have proper compensation for the group. It's just wicked.
Edward?
Well, I just want to... The one point there, and I entirely take where Joe's coming from, but the point I would say is I don't think what Kevin Hollingworth has just said is 75, take it or leave it. I think he's saying there is the potential to go a lot higher than that.
Yes, you go through an assessment. You say there's a full assessment.
The loss was greater than 75.
Yeah.
But some people, I think what he was saying, as I say, I only just listened to it then, who haven't lost as much as 75 may well wish to take the 75. Those who've lost a lot more may want to go through the assessment to try and get what they assess themselves as having lost back. I think that's what he's saying, but just like you, Joe, I'm watching that in real time, as it were.
The devil's in the detail.
No, I mean, Joe, that's how I understand it too, but there would be a full assessment to go through. There would be a process and paperwork. We also have, from the Labour Party, Jonathan Ashworth. I mean, listening to Joe's reaction, it's hardly surprising, Jonathan, because there's no trust, is there? There's just this sort of thing. It sounds reasonable, and Kevin Hollingworth was at pains, the minister, to say this is a pretty massive step, and it is a massive step when it comes to the overturning. But people just don't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, you've literally taken the words out of my mouth.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. You've said it with greater eloquence than I would have done. You can so understand why people are not trusting what has been said, or are very sceptical, or really wanting to look into the details. And I think the statement we've just heard is a very, very important statement. We want to see this exoneration, but of course, we do now need to look at the detailed plans. I presume the government will presumably publish a document or something like that, which we all need to look at and pore over.
Well, they've moved very quickly, of course. So, as Joe said, it's amazing. It's amazing what happens when the
when you put a drama out.
Well, when the motivation and momentum, political momentum, is there. I mean, do you trust politicians?
Do you know what the irony is?
Yeah, go on, Joe.
Can I just say what the irony is? None of this would be happening. People wouldn't be getting bulk, criminal convictions quashed if the group hadn't fought for all these years. And they're the ones that are not going to be paid. They've now extended the deadline to August next year. And by then it'll be 6 years since the group litigation. And people are in their 70s and 80s. I mean, for heaven's sake. And none of this would be happening if it wasn't for that group that fought through the courts. It beggars belief, honestly.
Right. Well, Joe, I think this might be a good point at which to play a bit of the drama where you are played by Monica Dolan. Let's have a look.
If you redeclare everything, it'll balance, OK?
This is so helpful, thank you. Don't go away, stay with me till I've done it. Oh, my God. It's just doubled right in front of my eyes. Now it says I'm £4,000 down.
It's a pretty incredible moment in the drama and comes early on. I mean, does it still keep you awake?
That really did happen. Yeah, that really did happen in December 2003, and we're in 2024. It shows you what a journey we've been on, honestly. It's just we want the money before we die. My husband was diagnosed with cancer last year, and you just think, thank goodness we've got a little bit of money so that we can pay for his treatment. And I'm not alone in that. It's just awful waiting. So I feel lucky that I was criminalised because I've had a chance at some compensation. But this group, Alan included, of all
Alan
things,
Bates,
haven't had proper money. And it's just scandalous why they can't just give them a decent sum and then work out the little bits later. But a lot of people have lost a whole pile of money, houses, businesses, the lot, marriages, and lives, We're all getting old.
Jo, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us your reaction after what feels like decades in this scandal. And you're still standing or sitting there talking to us. Maybe we'll talk to you again when we find out even more detail. But thank you for joining us. Vicky, just give us your reaction to some of the details that we heard there from Kevin.
Yeah, well, I think, she sums it up, doesn't she? And as you said, the lack of trust in the process. So 40 days, it'll be very important that does happen. And that is, that's quite an aim, isn't it? I think the other interesting thing there, we were talking about the public inquiry earlier, but, saying that they are quite a long way down this road. I mean, it's 3 years in, which is sort of helpful in many ways, but saying there that, the Post Office, incompetent malevolence coming out of that public inquiry. There'll be a lot more people watching that public inquiry tomorrow when it resumes than they might have been.
Well, and that's a good thing, isn't it? Thank you very much to my guests for joining me today. An important day for people like Jo Hamilton, a former sub-postmistress. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The Dragons are back.
Behind those doors.